months of his becoming a leader of his country. Not because he threatened to invade anyone, not because he was a dictator or a terrorist, but because he dared to say that Africa's resources should benefit Africans, that independence should be real and not just a word on paper, and that black people deserved to be treated with the same dignity and respect as white people. Imagine a brilliant young leader, only 35 years old, who spoke with such fire and conviction that he inspired millions across Africa to believe in true freedom. Now, imagine powerful nations conspiring to destroy him, to kill him, and to dissolve his mortal body in acid so that even his bones would disappear forever. This is not fiction. This is the story of Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, a man whose murder represents one of the most shameful and barbaric acts in modern history. In this edition of Back in History, we tell the story of Patrice Lumumba from his birth in a small village in Belgian Congo, through his rise as a brilliant speaker, an independence leader, to his historic moment as Prime Minister, and finally to his brutal assassination orchestrated by the West in conjunction with Congolese collaborators. This is a story about colonialism's refusal to let go, about how Cold War politics destroyed African dreams, and about how the West killed Africa's brightest hope because he refused to bow. We welcome you to this edition of Back in History. Patrice Emery Lumumba was born on July 2, 1925 in Onaloa, a village in Belgian Congo. Congo was not a normal colony. It was until 1908 the personal property of Belgium's King Leopold II, who had run it as a slave labor camp where millions of Congolese people died producing rubber and other resources for his personal profit. Even after Belgium took over from the king, Congo remained one of the most brutally exploited colonies in Africa. Belgians controlled everything. Congolese people had no rights, no voice, and no hope of advancement. They were treated as children at best and as animals at worst. Young Patrice Lumumba received some education in Catholic mission schools, which was rare for Congolese at the time. He was exceptionally intelligent and loved reading. He worked as a postal clerk, a respectable job for an African in colonial Congo. But his mind was always working on bigger questions. Why were Congolese people treated as inferior? Why did Belgium steal Congo's wealth while Congolese remained poor? How could this system be changed? He began writing articles and essays about these questions, expressing ideas that were considered dangerous by colonial authorities. In the 1950s, as independence movements were sweeping across Africa, Lumumba became politically active. He joined and later led the Congolese national movement known as MNC, which demanded independence from Belgium. Lumumba was not just a politician, he was a brilliant orator, someone who could speak and make people feel things deeply. His speeches were passionate, clear, and uncompromising. He talked about dignity, about the wounds of colonialism, about Congolese people's rights to control their own land and resources. Other leaders might speak carefully, trying not to offend the Belgians too much. But Lumumba spoke truth directly, and people loved him for it. Belgium, seeing that it could not hold Congo forever against the tide of African independence, reluctantly agreed to grant independence to the DR Congo. The date was set June 30, 1960. Elections were held, and Lumumba's MNC party won the most votes. He became Congo's first prime minister. Joseph Kasavubu, representing a more conservative faction, became the president. It seemed like Congo's moment had finally arrived. After decades of brutal colonialism, Congolese people would finally be free. Everyone was happy. The independence ceremony on June 30, 1960 became one of the most famous moments in African history. King Baudin of Belgium attended, expecting a polite ceremony where Congolese leaders would thank Belgium for bringing civilization to Congo. Baudin gave a speech praising his ancestor Leopold II, the same king whose regime had killed millions of Congolese people. He talked about Belgium's civilizing mission as if colonialism had been a favor to Congo rather than a crime against it. Then Patrice Lumumba stood up to speak. What he said shocked Belgium and electrified Africa. He did not read the prepared, polite speech. Instead, he spoke from his heart and his anger. He reminded everyone that Congo's independence was not a gift from Belgium, but something Congolese people had fought and died for. He talked about the humiliation and suffering under colonialism, how Congolese people had been treated like slaves in their own land, how they had been whipped, exploited, and killed. He declared that Congo would look to the future in dignity and freedom, that the wounds of colonialism were too fresh to forget. King Baudin was furious. Belgian officials were outraged. But across Africa, millions of people heard about Lumumba's speech and celebrated. Here was an African leader who did not apologize, who did not bow, but who spoke truth to the former colonial masters. Lumumba became an instant hero to Africans and to colonized people everywhere. He represented hope that independence could be real, that Africa could truly be free. But Lumumba's speech also made him powerful enemies. Belgium was angry and felt humiliated. Western powers, especially the United States, began watching him closely, and what they saw worried them deeply. Congo was not just any country, it was incredibly rich in minerals that Western industries needed desperately. Uranium from Congo had been used to make the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Copper, cobalt, diamonds, and other valuable minerals filled Congo's earth and still fuels it till today. Western corporations made enormous profits from these resources, and they were not willing to give up control just because Congo was now independent on paper. The trouble started immediately. Within days of independence, the Congolese army mutinied. Soldiers were angry because their Belgian officers still commanded them and treated them badly even after independence. The mutiny sparked chaos. Belgians living in Congo fled, claiming they were in danger. Belgium, without asking the new Congolese government, sent troops back into Congo, saying they needed to protect Belgian citizens. This was a violation of Congo's sovereignty, but Belgium did not care. Worse, the mineral-rich Katanga province in southern Congo declared independence. This was not a spontaneous decision by Katanga's people. It was organized by Belgian mining companies and Belgian officials who wanted to keep control of Katanga's copper and cobalt mines. They put Moise Tombe, a Congolese politician willing to work with Belgium, in charge of the breakaway province. Belgian troops and white mercenaries supported Katanga's secession. Suddenly, Congo's independence meant nothing. The country was falling apart, and Belgium was pulling the strings. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations for help. He asked the United Nations to send peacekeepers to get Belgian troops out of Congo and to help restore order. The United Nations sent troops, but they refused to act against Belgium and to help reunify the country. The United Nations mission, controlled by Western powers, seemed designed to maintain chaos rather than solve it. Frustrated and desperate, Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union for assistance. The Soviets sent planes and advisors to help the Congolese government. This decision sealed Lumumba's fate. The year was 1960, and the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was at its peak. American leaders saw every conflict through this lens. When Lumumba accepted Soviet help, they decided he was a communist threat, another Fidel Castro who might turn Congo into a Soviet ally. The fact that Lumumba was not a communist, that he had turned to the Soviets only after the West abandoned him, did not matter. CIA Director Allen Dulles called Lumumba dangerous and authorized covert action to remove him from power. That word remove was code. It simply meant to kill him. Belgium was already plotting against Lumumba. Belgium intelligence worked with Congolese military officers who opposed him. The key figure was Colonel Joseph Desire Mobutu, the army chief of staff. Mobutu was young, ambitious, and willing to work with the Belgians and Americans if it meant gaining power. He had been close to Lumumba once, but he was persuaded that siding with the West would serve him better. In September 1960, just 3 months after independence, President Kasavubu announced that he was dismissing Lumumba as prime minister. This was constitutionally questionable since the parliament, not the president, had the power to remove the prime minister. But constitutional niceties did not matter anymore at this point. Days later, on September 14, Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko launched a coup with backing from the CIA and Belgium. He announced that the army was taking over power and that politicians on both sides would be neutralized. Soldiers surrounded Lumumba's residence, placing him under house arrest. Lumumba was now a prisoner in his own capital, protected by United Nations peacekeepers who had orders not to let him leave, but also not to let his enemies capture him. It was a strange, tense situation. Lumumba remained defiant, giving speeches from his house, rallying his supporters, and refusing to give up. He knew his life was in danger, but he believed that if he could reach Stanleyville, a city in eastern Congo where his supporters controlled the regional government, he could organize resistance and reclaim power. His enemies knew this too, which is why they were desperate to capture him. On November 27, 1960, Lumumba decided to escape. In the middle of the night, he, his wife Pauline, and baby son, along with a few supporters, slipped past the United Nations guards and fled Leopoldville. They traveled by car towards Stanleyville, hundreds of miles away through dangerous territory. It was a desperate gamble. Mobutu's soldiers were searching for him. Roadblocks were set up across the country. For days, Lumumba's convoy moved through back roads and villages, sometimes welcomed by supporters, sometimes narrowly avoiding capture. But Mobutu's forces, with Belgian and American intelligence helping them track Lumumba's movements, eventually caught up with him. On December 1st, 1960, soldiers captured Lumumba near the Sankuru River. They beat him savagely in front of his wife and child, kicking and punching him while he was bound. The photos and film footage of his capture showing a bloodied and humiliated Lumumba being dragged and beaten would later circulate worldwide, shocking people with the brutality. He was flown back to Leopoldville and imprisoned in a military camp, where he was tortured repeatedly. For weeks, Lumumba was held in brutal conditions while his fate was debated. Some wanted to try him for crimes, though what crimes could be charged against the democratically elected leader who had been illegally overthrown was unclear. Others argued for simply killing him quietly. The problem was that Lumumba remained popular. Even imprisoned and beaten, he was dangerous to his enemies because his supporters might rise up to free him, or because international pressure might force his release. The situation the enemies decided was to send him somewhere he could be killed with plausible deniability. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba and two of his closest associates, Joseph Okito and Maurice Mpolo, were put on a plane. They were told nothing about their destination. Lumumba knew, though, that wherever they were going, death awaited. The plane was flown to Elizabethville, capital of the breakaway Katanga province, ruled by Moise Tombe, the Belgian puppet who hated Lumumba so seriously. Belgian officials and Katanga soldiers were waiting. That night in a house outside the city, Patrice Lumumba was executed by firing squad. Belgian officials commanded the execution. They wanted to ensure that he was really dead, that Africa's brightest hope was extinguished forever. But even in death, Lumumba was dangerous as a symbol. His body could become a shrine, a rallying point for his supporters. So his killers decided something monstrous. They dug up his body and dismembered it and dissolved it in acid. Belgian Police Commissioner Gerard Soet, who participated in disposing of Lumumba's remains, later admitted to taking one of Lumumba's teeth as a souvenir. For decades, this tooth was kept in Belgium as a trophy of murder. It was only in 2022, over 60 years after the assassination, that Belgium returned the tooth to Lumumba's family for burial in Kinshasa. The official story told to the world was that Lumumba had been killed by angry villagers while trying to escape custody in Katanga. Almost nobody believed this. The truth was obvious to anyone paying attention. Western powers had orchestrated the removal and murder of Congo's democratically elected leader because he refused to let them continue controlling his country's resources. It was a modern assassination planned in Washington and Brussels, executed in Africa, all to protect corporate profits and Cold War interests. The reaction across the world was explosive. In the Soviet Union, they named streets and universities after Lumumba, calling his death imperialist murder. Across Africa, people mourned and protested. In Egypt, protesters burnt down the Belgian embassy. African leaders saw clearly what Lumumba's assassination meant, namely, that independence was a lie if the West could simply kill any African leader who truly tried to serve his people rather than Western interest. Malcolm X, the American civil rights leader, called Lumumba the greatest black man who ever walked the African continent, saying his murder showed that the same racism and imperialism that oppressed black Americans was killing African leaders. The immediate aftermath in Congo was exactly what the West wanted. Mobutu, with continued American and Belgian support, consolidated power over the following years. He officially took over as dictator. He ruled Congo, which he renamed Zaire, for 32 years. His regime was one of the most corrupt in African history. While Mobutu became one of the world's richest men, stealing billions from his country, ordinary Congolese people remained among the poorest on earth. The potential that Lumumba had represented of a democratic Congo that used its mineral wealth to develop and serve its people was destroyed. Instead, Congo became a Cold War pawn and then a failed state, its resources still flowing to Western corporations while its people suffered through dictatorship, war, and poverty. For decades, the truth about Lumumba's assassination was officially denied. Belgium and the United States refused to acknowledge their roles. Declassified documents slowly revealed the reality. CIA papers showed that American agents had considered poisoning Lumumba and had definitely supported his overthrow. Belgian parliament inquiries in 2001 and 2002 finally forced Belgium to acknowledge moral responsibility for his death, though they stopped short of admitting direct participation in the murder itself. The evidence was overwhelming. This was a planned assassination carried out with Western knowledge, support, and participation. Today, Patrice Lumumba is remembered very differently than his killers intended. Rather than being forgotten, he became a martyr and a symbol. Statues of Lumumba stand in Kinshasa, in Moscow, and even in Brussels, where his memory serves as a rebuke to Belgium's colonial crimes. His speeches remain some of the most powerful expressions of African dignity and independence ever recorded. His most famous word still resonates, quote, "Without dignity there is no liberty. Without justice there is no dignity. Without independence, there are no free men. End of quote. Lumumba's legacy inspired the later generations of African leaders. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso saw Lumumba as a model of uncompromising integrity. Nelson Mandela of South Africa acknowledged Lumumba's influence on his own thinking about liberation. Revolutionary movements across Africa invoked Lumumba's name. He became a symbol of what African leadership could be, namely brilliant, courageous, committed to the people rather than to personal enrichments, willing to stand up to powerful nations rather than serve them.